The first time I met this artist named William Schaff, that's Will, I paid $80 to do it. So this is a picture of him by a photographer named Rich Dion, a newspaper photographer from Rhode Island. And in Will's public persona, he straddles fine art and commercial art with sort of ease that you don't see very often, right? So if you pay attention to him, there's this stream of very idiosyncratic visuals, but it's his fine artwork mixed with an album cover and a tattoo he designed for you, and a wedding invitation that was commissioned, and then back to sculpture about the Holocaust. And like it's, he does this with an ease that's pretty uncommon in the higher art worlds that I'm sort of most familiar with. And so in photographs, he wears these handmade masks. And so until this year, I have known about him and his work for about 15 years, and I've never known what he looks like. And in this year, in 2014, he went to the internet with a sort of plea for help. So he was losing his home. So he has this building. It houses his home, some other artist studios, a few apartments that he rents at low rates to artists, and it's this de facto community center where he lives in Warren, Rhode Island. There are concerts there, a screen printer who uses the back room. It's a pretty important space, and he was being foreclosed on for the second time. He was about to lose his home. He went to the internet and he said, please help. He made this video and he set up a fundraiser on Indiegogo, which you probably know. And the campaign was called Hold Down the Fort. And so the rewards that the website's model encourages were a sort of weird mix of existing artworks, mostly multiples, new works, services, tokens, promises. So for $200, he would spend an hour speaking to you on a webcam without a mask. For $360, he would send you handmade, unique mail art every month for a year. And for $80, this was the quote, spend a day at the fort. I can give you art lessons, or we can just create things together. But the point is, it's your day. So this is a really weird offer with an incredibly weird price. And so I felt like I had to do it. So I sent him $80, and I chose the day in the studio as my reward. And over the course of this 1 month campaign, 19 other people did the same. So there were 20 of us who chose a day in the studio. In a month, this online campaign, it raised $47,812 to save Will's house. There was also an offline campaign that raised a whole bunch more. So he's still there. So I met Will about 15 years after I first sort of knew about his work, and I drove up a few hours to the fort, which is in Warren, Rhode Island. And I sort of like crept in through a broken screen door, and I couldn't find anything. It was a little like sketchy, and I hear from the back this voice, and it says, "Hello, Miss Allison," and it was Will in the back. It's a little cluttered, as you can see, so it was hard to see him at first. And we got some chairs and some drinks, and we sat down and we talked. And people wandered in and out all day. It's a storefront. It's on the sort of one street in Warren with some businesses near the water. And one man popped his head in, and he asked if any of the crosses in one of the front windows were for sale. And Will just said, no, they're my private collection. And the man just ducked his head back out. He left without another word. And later Will told me, well, if the guy had said, I've got $500 in my pocket, then maybe he would have said, yeah, you can have whatever you want. He needs $500. There's only like 2 he wouldn't have let go of, but the guy led with how much, and you know he's going to haggle. And I didn't say anything about the fact that the guy hadn't said how much. He hadn't led with that at all. So later in the day, I noticed something in this big glass case. And I asked about it, and he was like, oh, touch it. Really, pick it up. And I sort of hesitated, and he sort of came around, and he helped me get this big glass case open, and he handed it to me. And it was this little paw. This perfect little paw on a little plinth, sort of rough hewn. And it was really perfect. It was like supple. It was like it was alive. And it was maybe a raccoon or a possum. He didn't know. And he told me it was made by this guy in Georgia. He'd been in this shop, and the guy came in with a bunch of them. And the shop sells them for $13. So the guy makes about like $6.50 each. And I said something like, oh, that's not enough. And Will immediately shut me down. He was like, well, if you make a big stew out of that meat, yeah, it's enough. It'll work out. So we talked for a few hours, and then he starts to fidget. and he says he has to go to work. So we talked and drew for a few hours. And he's got this mail art club that he's had for a few years, and he's had to get really efficient. So he showed me these images of the earlier pieces and sort of like spoke wistfully about them. Like, look at the coloring here, that took forever. And now he tries to get them down to an hour a piece. He's got this system. And that's $30 a piece, $30 an hour. That's not great, but it works out. And he says he's got a system, but all of the ones that I saw him make took a lot more than an hour. Later we went across the street to a bar, and eventually I said I had to go. So Will walked me out, and we hovered outside for a while. And he was real sheepish. This guy who'd been so great all day, sort of, And we talked, and it wasn't great. It was weird. Like, we couldn't talk anymore. And then he, sort of looked up and said, "You don't have to pay for it." And I just laughed and said, yeah, I know. So it used to be that when I was at a party and I introduced myself, I said that I was an artist. So a lot of my work was about knowledge, classification, science. The last really big project that I did was, as an artist, was the artist work classification. So I spent a couple of years doing research on what it is that artists do when they are doing art. What artistic practice really consists of. And then I created a classification system for that labor, for the sort of everyday activities that artists engage in to do their work. And what it is now is sort of sculpture, bookwork, public artwork. So there's 600 of these books. They're in libraries all over the world. And it outlines the classification system as if it were for use. And it's pretty convincing. And the idea was that a viewer, when they came across this, would have a moment where they thought that this was real, that this was how the world was, that there was this system that we use. And it's real in some ways, and it's not real in others. So these are details from an exhibition that was related to the work. And like a lot of my artwork, it looked kind of like social science. So I kind of decided to become a scientist. And in 2008, I went back for a PhD in sociology. I had never taken a sociology class before I began my PhD program. It was interesting. And I actually finish next month. My dissertation is done and in. Yeah. So now I study how people talk about the value of the things that they do. Like how we say that what we do is worth doing. And specifically, my research asks how visual artists, very broadly defined, account for the value of their own artistic practice. So the first project that I did when I went to graduate school looked at how artists' account of value changed over time. And so what I did was I looked at artists' organizations engaged in fights over remuneration in 3 countries since the 60s. And I showed that artists sort of shifted over that time from an emphasis on the value of their products to a sort of vocabulary of service provision. And this was despite actually relatively stable practices, as well as institutional gains that should have served to strengthen their identities as producers of objects. So just as they were winning some rights as object producers, they shifted to a language of service provision. And I think that this is really closely tied to a sort of occupational turn in the visual arts that's happened over this same period, where a majority of artists today experience their artistic practice as work, as a job, talk about themselves as professionals. And this is very, very decoupled from markers of a job in most of the world, right? So despite sort of no relationship to employment, income. And so I looked at this. This is actually how I met Lise for the first time. So WAGE was one of the many organizations that I was looking at and writing about. And when I finished this paper, which is, I went to a thing that Lise and her colleagues were a part of. And I was like, hey, this is weird. I know everything you've ever said in public. And I just wrote a paper about you. What's up? So that was a couple years ago. Anyway, but in that project, I was only looking looking at one art world, really. I was looking at this sort of like high elite contemporary international art world. And even within that world, there's a lot of dissent. There's a lot of argument. And of course, if you think about art more broadly, this is only one very small slice of the people, even just in the US, who make things. And I started to wonder about variation in this sort of bigger community of practice. So for the project I've been doing for the last couple of years, I've been trying to think about variation in the ways that artists in the US account for the value of the things that they do. And I have like all this methodological stuff I could talk to you about, which I think is super interesting and really important. And I'm happy to if anybody's interested, but it's really nerdy and boring. So I will just say, I define visual artists as people who have exhibited things that were understood to be visual art in a visual arts context in the past year. So I've talked to people who have their work in the Guggenheim, and I've talked to people whose most important exhibition in their whole life was at a church cafe in South Dakota. I've done interviews in ethnography in like 4 chunks of the country, roughly. And I've been to a lot of places, I've talked to a lot of people. And I spent a really long time trying to understand the ways that artists talk about the things that they do and looking for sort of patterns and causal relationships. And so really broadly speaking, I find sort of 4 types of accounts to be really widespread across this big community of people who might end up in this room and people who wouldn't be in this room because they're too fancy and people who would never know about this room because they're not really in a community like this one. So I'm going to talk about these types quick, and then I'm going to talk about theory, which is, I think, more interesting. So the first type of account that I found to be really widespread was what I'll call a pecuniary account. Okay, I gotta give them names. It's not great, but whatever. And these are the sort of bread and butter, bottom line accounts of value that we're all pretty familiar with. So when I say pecuniary accounts, what I mean are stories like this one from Josh. So he answered really quickly when I asked him whether he considered his finances when he began a new project. And he says, I always have. Even when I was borrowing money from the bank to make work and factoring how I would pay it back and the math that would be required in order to pay it back, doing math like, this photo is going to cost $25,000 to make, and it'll be an edition of 5, and each one will sell for $15,000, which means I'll make $7,500 for each, which means that $7,500 times 5 is the total income, less the investment of $25,000 equals this. In my head, yes. Okay, so this kind of bottom line accounting, it obviously translates really well to an occupational vision of artistic practice, right? The time implied between investment and return is sort of short-term, sort of specific. They're really confident. People can make calculations on the fly. They use numbers. And these are straightforward accounts, and they make sense to everyone, kind of. So a second type of account is what I'm going to call credentialing accounts. So we can see these when artists, they point to teaching, they point to commercial work. They say, I could always teach. When they use skills that are gained through artistic practice to occupy these really weird and well-remunerated niches. So Carlton tells me, I just sort of realized that being kind of competent, media and technology was a way to support myself. So for a long time, my job was doing 16mm loopers for museums. It was something that I just found out no one really knew how to do. Not that many people could do it. So I think the thing that we think of when we talk about art as a credential, we think about teaching, right? Like that's the obvious jump. Maybe we talk about commercial work, a photographer doing wedding photography, but there's actually a lot of artists out there doing work that you could learn another way. But their art work trained them to do that work. So I've talked to a professional engineer who didn't go to engineering school. He's a sculptor. And he ended up getting hired because he's so familiar with sort of 3D drawing and rendering on a computer, and that's how he ended up in this position. Now he works as an engineer. That's actually a pretty tough field to break into without an engineering degree. But he did it, and I've talked to these people, sort of, they exist everywhere. And this is a type of account that, like bread and butter accounts, it makes sense, right? It makes sense in this world of art as a job. And it makes sense outside the art world. We see artists sort of engaging with the world of markets and market work, and they're finding paid employment as artists in ways that both make sense to artists generally, right? So artists have for centuries sold artworks, taught others how to make art, done things that are closely tied to their artwork, but done commercially, right? That's common for hundreds of years. And in this world of jobs, where selling your products, selling your skills, selling your time by the hour, by the piece, that makes a lot of sense to people. But these are not like the only way we talk about the value of the things that we do, and we are not always like rational, liberating actors. So, artists, they're not robots, right? We're not robots. So a third type of account that I'm going to talk about a little is one that I'm going to call relational. So these accounts are really strongly rooted in art worlds, but they're often oriented to a really wide public. So Rosemary, she has a collaborator, and full-time they run a very large project, and it costs them $26,000 a year. So she sums up this relational impulse really eloquently. She says, people used to say, well, you guys must be so rich to do this. And okay, I grew up poor, it's real money, but at the same time, other people who are like in the middle class or whatever, they spend that much on school tuition for their kid. Nobody thinks twice about it. So I really resist the idea that this is somehow abnormal. Like, I think it should be as normal as paying $26,000 for a year for, instead of having a kid, we have our community. And she went on to talk about how much food we spend on their dinners. So this is pretty widespread in the art community. And a fourth type that I think we all know is what I'm going to call vocational, right? This shouldn't be surprising to anyone with experience in the arts. So in these accounts, time is sort of irrelevant, it's suspended, it's transcendent. There's no division between work and life. There's no regulated sort of modern clock time. You don't see numerical justifications, you don't see calculations, you don't see numbers at all. And unlike other types of accounts, all three of the others, the art world isn't really the basis of action in these accounts, right? The only relevant actor is the self. So these accounts, they don't have a public orientation. They don't point directly to any art worlds. These are the sort of arguments that the activities that we do for love, not money, have real value. So Armando tells me, when I say time for myself, I mean time for my work. Or I'm talking to Peter and he makes us both laugh because he says, I'm just one of these people who's always working, which is really hard financially, right? And we laugh, but we totally get it, right? Like, it's not confusing to people who have experience in the arts. So these four types, they aren't mutually exclusive. This is really important. They're not personal traits. So a different practice can be accounted for in a different way, and individuals, they sort of move synchronically and temporally between different types of account. And so when Lise was presenting earlier, she talked about, what did you call them? Irreconcilable differences?
Irreconcilable contradictions.
Yes. So I started to notice that artists, within a narrative, even within a sentence, would say things that were logically completely incompatible. And there are a couple of ways in sociology to think about that, and none of them seemed sufficient for me. So this is where I end up doing theoretical work. So I began to sort of notice these patterns in the ways that people deployed 2 and 3 types of account within a single narrative. And I spent some time looking to find out what these patterns were. So I thought, we're going to go like this, which is going to be weird because whatever. So I thought these two, like pecuniary and credentialing accounts, they would co-occur most frequently because they make sense together, right? Like there's a logic there. And I actually was really like, for a long time, for years, I had this thought that these two were going to get collapsed into one sort of instrumentally rational category, and my work was going to be so much more easy to talk about. But when I looked at these piles that I made, that doesn't happen, actually. It's really uncommon. So relational accounts, oh look, I can do a pointer. Relational accounts and pecuniary accounts, they didn't co-occur. And that, I would have expected that, right? Like, we don't talk about those two forms of value in the same sentence, in the same story very often. That was not a surprise. But those two accounts, Also, you never find them together. That's even less common, actually. And I had this one really big pile, and it was kind of sliding off my desk, and it was this group of stories that really wove bread and butter and vocational accounts in and out of one another. And this was despite the fact that they were really hard to marry, actually. So pecuniary accounts, they're short-term and they're specific. Vocational accounts, they call on these transcendent and suspended notions of time. So there are numerical justifications in pecuniary calculation. Numbers are completely banished from this world of vocationalist accounts. But they were by far the most sort of frequently co-occurring types of account. So the fact that these two types of account are used in concert so often, it might seem strange to an analyst who expects to hear logically coherent accounts, right? But it's not that interesting even if you have any experience in the world of any of the arts, where like this dance between love and money is really central to arts practice. And it has been for some time. So, see what I did there? So I think that this room around doing it for money and doing it for love is pretty centrally constitutive of art practice today. And it's this space where we all know the same dance, but we sort of improvise our own flourishes. So the artists that I spoke to, I think what they were doing was they were using pecuniary and vocationalist accounts together to position themselves and their practices as both serious, which today is really highly occupationalized, it's very professionalized. It means professional, being an occupationally committed working artist, regardless of your training, regardless of your income. And being called, doing it for money, doing it for love at the same time. So I think that they were trying to draw this really specific landscape of value. One that was not the socially dominant, socially sort of acceptable, instrumentally rational one, but also not one that was based on doing it for love. They weren't saying that art making makes sense insofar as it leads to employment in or outside of the arts, even though they were saying that it was a job, it was an occupation, and that was the sort of primary way to make a living as an artist. They really see themselves battling an instrumentalized version of art practice. And they were working really hard to say, these are hard things to say at the same time. So they were working really hard to say that what they did made sense because of something different, something more. It wasn't just instrumentally rational. Even when they talked to their mom, who was like, get a job. Like, they were not assenting to this view. So, okay, so this is like an aside into something that's boring but totally interesting, actually. So I'm an economic sociologist now. So when economic sociologists talk about commensuration, what they're talking about is the process by which we agree to gauge diverse things by a common metric. So what we're talking about is that we agree to value something in dollar terms, right? And we accept that that doesn't capture everything, but we just agree that that's how we're going to have a communication. So the use of cost-benefit analysis is like the best example and is most commonly used in this field, but so is pricing an artwork. So is putting a dollar value on your time, right? You're using the common metric of the dollar to assert value. So my work now is mostly concerned with developing a concept of sort of decommensuration. So I define that as a process of disagreement where conflict about appropriate orders of worth or regimes of value, they come to be expressed in diverse and divergent valuations. And I'm arguing that this is a process of sort of individual and collective revaluation of objects and practices about which there's some social agreement about value. And it's this process of disagreement, which is sort of abstracted out of my data, that I'd argue it's generalizable outside of the arts. And it's really crucial to understanding value in the arts and outside of the arts, right? So this process, I'm going to talk about it in working life. I think it has 3 stages. So in this first stage, an existing field of activity, art, whatever, a tradition gets rationalized and becomes understood as properly an occupation, a job. And I think when that happens, tensions between distinct orders of worth become really salient for some people. And those practitioners express that discomfort in sort of conflicts over the valuation of their practice. So when this happens, questions of value become like hot topics. They become everyday conversation. And in the history of the arts, you can see this happening in waves, right? So right now we're actually in one, like we're here. The last big wave was in the late 60s and early 70s. And then there's the second stage where these conflicts take the form of really diverse accounts of value by practitioners. So these are like distinct routes to valuation. They actually don't pit value against values, but they aim to include some bases of value while excluding others. So artists say they do it for love and for money and for leisure and for community and for politics and credentials and relationships, right? They say lots of things. But then, I think what happens, and you can see this in the 60s, 70s, and I think you'll be able to see it today, 20 years from now, when we know what happens, is that some bases of value end up drawing really heavily on contemporary visions of historical practice. So what I mean by that is there are lots of arguments that pop up in archives from time to time. So art making is just like plumbing is one of them. So in the 60s and 70s, you see lots of people stand up and make an eloquent, logically coherent argument about how art making is just like plumbing. And then they sit down and no one says anything, right? Like this does not resonate with people. Whereas the next person stands up and talks about what they do in a way that draws, say, on this sort of ancient vision of art as contributing to the public good, and everyone in the audience is like up, right? Like some things resonate with groups and some things don't. And I think what explains that is the ways that we draw on our historical imaginary. Not necessarily what art making actually was 50 or 100 or 300 or 1,000 years ago. We're drawing on what we think about what it was, which is not necessarily true, right? So I think what we see is we see pecuniary and credentialing. I should probably have brought a pointer or something. What we see is these two types of account that fit the world we live in. They fit it well, right? They fit this occupationalized world of artistic practice. And then we find two that don't fit it so well. And the reason that they're so widespread is that they each draw on a vision of traditional artistic practice. Vocationalist accounts, they fit this sort of long-held assumption that artists have to create, right? That they do it for love, not money. That they enjoy artwork, that practice is its own reward. And we see relational accounts that sort of harken back to really like ancient moral arguments about the beautiful and the good, and that promote artistic practice for the benefit of society as a whole, for both artists and for audiences as citizens. So I think this idea of decommensuration as a process, it lets us see patterns by which valuation in a community of practice is contested. And I think we should expect to see this in any field of activity where traditional practice has mostly been supplanted by marketized practice, but not well enough to completely supersede it. So, care of young children, care of the sick, politics, religion. These are all fields where questions of value and the value of working life are really present today. And I think that's because we have seen some market work enter those fields, but not well enough to replace them entirely. We have a majority of children in some form of care, but we also have lots of parents staying home to take care of their own children, right? We have people in politics who are highly trained to do politics, competing for salaries with people who have no political background at all, but a good degree in marketing. And those people are working alongside people who are volunteers, who are not getting paid at all, but who work more than full time, right? So these are all fields where traditional practice is mostly supplanted by a job, but not quite. And I think with a theory of how these processes work in these fields, we can sort of see how those conversations will play out, what kinds of strategies might be effective for changing the rules, right? And that's why I think it's interesting. I think valuation really matters. And I think that a sociological perspective on it is something that's valuable because valuation is something that we do together, right? So we know that the value of things aren't determined by their qualities. They're not determined by like an unseen godlike hand, right? So even the invisible hand that Smith talks about, which a lot of people have like a sort of lay understanding of, and I teach that text, and like undergrads, their minds get blown, right? Because that invisible hand moves. It's like the pointer on a Ouija board, right? It moves not because of ghostly spirits, but because of animal spirits, right? And we move it ourselves. We move it together. And so when we talk about value, we're not usually talking about money, and we're definitely not just talking about money. We're talking about what we do, and we're talking about who we are. So right now I'm working on a project that's about artists' audits. I'm trying to talk to as many artists as I can who have been audited by the State Departments of Revenue or by the IRS. And the reason for this is I think of audits as a sort of crystallization of these conflicts between diverse forms of value. And it's a really important site of conflict between artists and the state in the US. Most national contexts actually have a lot more sites that artists interact with the state on an individual level. And we don't have a lot of those. Like, we don't have state regulation of who gets to be an artist. We don't have state-run art schools in the same way. We do, sort of. But I've written a lot about one artist in particular, and I'm going to talk about it because I kind of feel like I just talked about math for a while, and it was boring, and I want to talk about like the world where I live. So her name is Venus de Mars. Venus in front. This is Venus and her wife Lynette in a photo by a Minnesota artist named Wing-Young Huey. So she's a musician, she's a visual artist, she lives in Minneapolis. And for about a year and a half, this just ended, she's been undergoing this audit by the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And we met because I heard about it, and I heard that it was interesting, and I wanted to know more. So the first time I ever talked to her, I called her, and she was up on the North Shore in Minnesota. She had just played a show. She called me at like 2 a.m. It was a little weird. And she was out in a backyard, and she was sort of pacing in the dark, and it was cold, and she's just talking. You know, our whole conversation was like that. And she told me her story, and at the end of that, I asked an intentionally silly question because I wanted to hear her response. So I said, wasn't like the worst possible outcome just a change in her tax status, and maybe she'd owe a little money back? Why does that matter? And her voice caught, and she said, it feels like it's discrediting me as a person, she said, and just throwing my 20-year career out the window, saying, you were just playing the whole time. It can crush you. So at this point, she hadn't held a day job in 10 years. The year in question, she made about $30,000 from her artwork. And for more than a decade, she had worked with an accountant to file a Schedule C every year with her tax return as self-employed. But the Minnesota Department of Revenue, they issued an opinion ruling her to be officially a hobbyist. And this is a big deal. You guys know why. I'm not going to worry. Whatever. We can talk about it later if anybody doesn't know why that's a big deal. So the IRS and the state departments of revenue that use their guidelines, they say that in order to qualify as a business for tax purposes, you have to show a profit motive, right? This is actually what the rule is. A lot of people say things. They say, you need to make a profit 3 years out of 5 or whatever. Those are not true. That is not the rule. The rule is that you have a profit motive.
Is this federal or
Yes, federal and state. Most states use the IRS definitions. Some states have their own, but they're more modifications. So it turns out that these rules we all know, these like layperson rules, they don't matter. And if you think about how businesses that are not art businesses run, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of businesses don't make a profit their first 5 years. A lot of real businesses, right? That's not really how you think about what a business is versus what a hobby is. And so for the state, profit motive is what matters. But motives and intentions are really hard to prove. I think that should be clear. So artists, I think, are really especially vulnerable to this ambiguous requirement because generations of artists have been taught to act as though they make art for love and not money, right? So when the Minnesota Department of Revenue issues their final determination that reclassifies Venus as a hobbyist, they sent her this long document that explains why. And so one section reads, you may have noticed that I do this when I'm quoting. I don't know where that comes from. I think it's better than going like this, I guess. So, the presence of personal motives in carrying on of an activity may indicate that the activity is not engaged in for profit. So underneath that, there are bullet points that outline the evidence against her. And so there's just a few words. But in these few words, the auditor's letter, it sort of calls into question these like centuries-old Western visions of art as an expression of the artist's soul, right? So the auditor is a man. He recasts an aesthetic choice and maybe even like a savvy brand building strategy as a black mark on her record. So the first point reads very simply: the music and art are self-created by the taxpayer and based on her life experience and perspective and are intensely personal. Therefore, she is not an artist, right? Like that's the definition of hobbyist for them. And sometimes the line between professional and amateur is a really bright, clear one, right? We can all think of examples. But in the US, artists are, for the most part, just artists. They move in and out of day jobs and commercial work and employment and unemployment and windfall and drought, right? And words like professional artist, serious artist, working artist, they're kind of fighting words. And they mean so much because we actually don't agree here about what they mean, and we prefer not to agree. And I think that our uncertainties about who counts and who doesn't is actually part of why we are rewarded with a pretty like rich and vibrant cultural life in our country. And Lise mentioned the sort of elitism of the arts, but compared to other contexts, we actually have an incredibly diverse body of people making art in the US. They're not all doing well, they're not all famous, but we have a really increased, like an amazing diversity compared to most national contexts. And I think that no clear definitions, right? We have occasional obscenity trials, we have occasional copyright trials, but that's about it. There aren't authorities to enforce the boundaries. And somehow the state departments of revenue and the IRS end up being somehow the only mechanisms that the state has to determine your status with any finality. It's the auditor who decides whether you're an artist or maybe you're not. So I've written a lot about Venus and her audit, like a lot. So I'm just going to jump to the end of her story. So without the support of her community, Venus and Lynette would have never been able to fight. I probably never would have heard of them. Very few working artists have the sort of cash reserves on hand to engage in any kind of fight with the state. And not that many have the sort of decades of commitment to community that ended up meaning that Venus and Lynette could raise a lot of money. So when it comes to taxes, like with everything, the ability to fight is kind of for those who can afford it. And so it took about a year and a half of fighting. There was a heart attack, like it was a big deal. And $12,000 in lawyer's fees. And then Venus received a notice in the mail. And it read in part, after reviewing all of the information available, it is our determination that the taxpayer's art and music activity was engaged in for profit as defined under Treasury. And at the back of the letter, she found a check for $70. Because the department's audit shows that Venus was, after all, owed a small refund. So, in my work, I try to understand and explain the ways that artists talk about the value of the things that they do. And the patterns that I found sort of led me to this concern with commensuration as a social process and with decommensuration in working life, this sort of theory of valuation that I am trying to develop. But I closed with like this story about Venus because that's a fairly technical conversation in a lot of ways, but it's one that's about like the ground where I live, right? Audits are this rare site of conflict, and I think Venus's story shows how deeply these debates that can seem technical can cut. So, I said it before, right? When we talk about value, we're not talking about money. We're talking about who we are, who we want to be, right? And that is all that I have to say. So, yeah. To be here, and I just wanted to say something about the next stuff. So, one of the things that I wanted to get across in all this talking was these are political questions, right? These actually aren't economic questions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We're going to have a panel after lunch and after Pecha Pucha, and there will be a couple of us who will give some position statements. So, I don't know what time it is, but if we have time now, I will talk to anybody who wants to talk, and we will also be back, me and 5 others later. So, how are we doing on time?
How are we doing with that?
Maybe you will say something.
My one question is, where can we read your papers and your research?
So some of it is out in the world, like I have a website, I'm searchable. Some of it is coming out soonish, and some of it is a book. I can send you my dissertation, it's really boring. But yeah, there will be, I've done a bunch of writing about people like Venus, so that stuff is like online, and there's some academic stuff that's probably paywalled and I can send it to you, and there will be a book soonish, but that takes a long time. Yeah. Yeah?
I was just wondering if you ever thought about checking insurance for the value of art, because I have a friend, for example, he did something called the Architect of Immobility, and someone backed into it. It was just a sculpture that he did, and he had to figure out with the insurance agent, like the value of that, even though he refuses to sell his art at all anywhere. So that's interesting stuff.
Yeah, so that, insurance is a super good site for looking at that stuff, and I totally agree. In my work, so I think there's really actually good stuff on pricing of objects. I think the best work is this book by Olav Veltus called Talking Prices. I think there's good research on how we price art objects. I also don't think that that's a very good way to think about value in the arts, because very few artists make a living selling objects. Relatively few sell objects at all in a meaningful extent, right? So I think thinking about...
You look at a cancellation of a music concert, which they must insure. I'm with you.
But the thing is like, that's still an object in a sense, right? Like a musician's life is not just their concerts.
Right.
And I think since we have really good research on objects and their pricing, I don't really do that. I lean on that work a lot when I do need to talk about objects and their prices. But what I'm interested in is the practice of contemporary art or music or whatever, all these things, or taking care of children. And that is really under-considered. Partly because it's hard, and partly because the prices of objects is super interesting, right? I mean, the prices of diamonds is also super interesting. But yeah, I don't pay as much attention to that, but insurance is a super interesting way, and contract law is an interesting way to get at it, right? Yeah, and those are studies of commensuration, right? So my favorite study of commensuration is done by this woman named Marion Fourcade, who I don't know. And it's about the pricing of nature. So she looks at 2 big oil spills and tries to understand why the French basically say their world costs nothing, and why we say our world costs a ton. And it's in these conversations about who is a stakeholder, who matters, how do you pay them, what's their loss, right? And the basic argument, which is interesting, is that the French conceptualized the local users of the shoreline as the people who had experienced a loss. And they calculated, like, the value of the snails that died, each snail. Whereas we decided, Exxon oil spill, that our nation's people had we subjectively valued that there was a pristine shoreline up there. And so all of us were considered in the counting. And it was like many, many millions it was exponentially higher what this spill cost, even though the spill in France was much, much bigger and caused much more damage. So that's like, those are the sorts of interesting commensuration studies that I'm sort of building on.
What was her name?
Fourcade, Fourcade. And there's like a paper on that called Sense and Sensibility. And it's on the differentiating sort of valuation of nature in different countries. Yeah.
I had a question just about the interested in the phenomenon of professionalization. You sort of kind of mentioned it briefly about sort of historical emergence. And is there something in particular that you could recommend?
So I like Julia Bryan Wilson's work on art workers. I think her book Art Workers is really good. There's a book called, it's by Singerman. It's about the rise of the MFA. Yes! I would recommend those 2, art subjects. And it's basically about like the GI Bill and what part that played in the development of the MFA as a norm. And like now we're actually cross-nationally moving towards the PhD as the terminal degree, and I have lots of opinions about that. It's crazy. And so that's happening again. It used to happen in up until the 60s, and now that's coming back.
We have earlier models in the academy, like the French Art Academy in the
Right.
previous centuries, so professionalization of practice.
Yeah, but so there's like professionalization as you can measure it, but then there's also qualitative experience of professionalization. And what I think is new since I would say the 90s that it's widespread, is the experience of everyday artists. So like when I think of artists, I think of a really big group of people, and the median artist there doesn't sell things in any meaningful way. Maybe a lot of people don't think of them as an artist, they think of them as a hobbyist, right? There's a lot going on there. And the fact that that person feels the need to perform professionalism is quite new. And if you look historically, sort of at like oral history interviews and stuff with people, they don't use the same language, and I don't think they felt the same way about themselves. I don't think they felt that what they did was a job in any sense. Whereas that's very widespread now. Like it's very common, even among the people for whom I might argue, most of us might argue it's not their job. They feel at least a very intense pressure to perform that it's a job for others to be taken seriously. Yeah?
Is there any research on sort of Protestant work ethic and how this influences the connection to our sort of cultural understanding of value?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. There's lots of it. I'm trying to. So the book that I think is the best about this. There's a couple of them, but there's this book by Chad Allen Goldberg, who's the title of which I can't actually remember. It's Citizens and Paupers, maybe, but that might be another book. But that's his name. He wrote this awesome book about welfare, where he sort of argued that different forms of welfare, by which I mean also like Social Security and all these things that are redistribution. And he sort of argued that in the US there was this really fundamental change from thinking of different forms of redistribution as charity to thinking of them as appropriate only for workers who could no longer work for whatever reason, right? So people had to be reimagined as potential workers or as failed workers, not as morally suspect people. And he sort of traces that in a very Weberian, sort of iron cagey kind of conversation. I think it's the best book that I've read about it. But there's a lot of like sociology about the Protestant ethic and about, I mean, our foundational texts are basically like Weber and Durkheim and Marx, and yeah, all of the people that we think of as like the canonical sociologists basically were sociologists of value and work, and so there is a lot of stuff on that. A lot of it's fairly inaccessible, of course, if you're not in the field because it's technical and stuff. But there is a lot of work on this, and I think it's a part of what's going on. But I think there's also a rationalization piece, right? Like a modernity story that's about people having to fit into a marketized and rationalized environment, and that's not quite the Protestant ethic piece, you know, like that. It's not about how I feel; it's partly about like how the world changed.
How do you feel about like Tony Rivera's work?
So we're gonna set out. Lunch is set out, and